What would you do if a single letter could ruin your life, destroy someone else's, and still feel impossible not to send? I'm 88 years old now, and my hands shake as I admit this. But everything began on a night I still replay in my mind, like a curse I never escaped. Back then I wasn't old, sick, or reflective. I was terrified, and fear has a way of pushing ordinary people into lifelong secrets. The first letter wasn't planned. It wasn't clever or poetic. It was written in a rush, late at night, with the curtains closed and the radio turned up too loud, just in case silence betrayed me. I remember staring at the envelope, knowing that once it left my hands, nothing would ever be the same again. No signature, no return address, just words meant for one person, and one person only. That anonymity felt like protection, but it was also a sentence. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, just one letter, just enough to release the pressure building inside my chest. But secrets don't dissolve when exposed halfway. They multiply. Every unanswered question creates another reason to stay hidden. Weeks passed, then months, and before I understood what I was becoming, I was waiting for responses that never came, studying postal routes, changing handwriting, aging alongside the lies. Each decade added weight. The world changed. Wars ended. Presidents died. Families grew old. But the letters continued, always anonymous, always careful, always carrying pieces of a truth that could never be spoken aloud. I convinced myself it was safer this way. That silence was mercy. That distance made it less real. Yet every envelope carried guilt, fear, and a growing realization that I had trapped myself inside a story with no ending. There were nights I almost stopped, nights I told myself I was done, but once you build a life around secrecy, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. And the longer it went on, the more impossible it became to reveal who I was, especially to the one person who had unknowingly lived under the shadow of my words for 55 years. Before this story moves forward, there is something important you need to understand. Stories like this are not just about secrets, letters, or anonymous lives hidden in the past. They are about how silence shapes people, how truth left buried for decades can quietly damage families, identities, and entire lives without anyone realizing it. Understanding these confessions means understanding how ordinary people become part of extraordinary secrets, often without ever intending to. If this story has already made you feel uneasy, curious, or uncomfortable, that reaction matters. I want to know what you think about secrets carried this long. Do you believe some truths should stay hidden forever, or does every confession deserve to be heard, no matter how late it comes? Leave a comment and tell me what you think, because your perspective becomes part of this story now. If you are finding value in this confession, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. That support allows these hidden stories, these forgotten truths, and these final confessions to continue being told instead of disappearing with the people who carry them. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to know someone's life from the shadows, to watch them age, suffer, love, and change without them ever knowing you exist? For 55 years, there was only one person who received my letters. Not a group, not an institution, just one name, written again and again until it felt burned into my memory. Choosing them was not accidental. It was inevitable. Back in the late 1960s, this person stood at the center of something they never fully understood. To the outside world, they were ordinary, almost forgettable. A job, a family, routines that looked harmless. But I knew what sat beneath that surface because I had been there when a single decision changed everything. My letters were never threats. They were reminders, fragments of truth delivered slowly, carefully, like drops of poison spaced far enough apart to avoid detection. I studied their reactions without ever seeing their face, changes in address, subtle shifts in tone when, years later, a response finally came. Yes, they did respond, but never directly, not with words, with actions, moves, silences. Each reaction confirmed they understood more than they admitted, and that terrified me more than hatred ever could. Fear keeps people predictable. Understanding does not. I could never reveal my name because my identity was tied to the very event they were running from. If they knew who I was, they would know how close the truth really sat, how fragile the story they told themselves had always been. I wasn't just a witness. I was part of the machinery that made the lie possible. A neighbor, a colleague, someone they had trusted without question. As the decades passed, the letters changed. Less detail, more implication. The power was no longer in what I said, but in what I didn't. Every envelope forced them to remember something they desperately wanted buried, and every year I stayed anonymous. The balance held. Reveal my name, and everything collapsed, including me. Do you know the exact moment when a mistake stops being a mistake and becomes a life sentence? For me, it happened in the mid-1960s, during an event so ordinary that no history book would ever record it, yet so decisive that it sealed everything that followed. One conversation, one hesitation, one choice not to speak when speaking would have changed everything. Back then, the truth was still flexible. It could have been corrected, explained, even forgiven. The person who would later receive my letters stood only a few feet away from me that day, unaware that their future had just been quietly altered. What they didn't see was what happened just before they arrived, the exchange that never officially occurred, the document that vanished, the name that was replaced by another. No violence, no dramatic confrontation, just silence doing its work. That was when I understood something terrifying. Lies don't need to be elaborate to survive, they just need cooperation. Mine came in the form of fear. Fear of consequences, fear of being linked to something far larger than I had ever intended. Government names were whispered, investigations stalled. People were encouraged to forget. And I did what so many ordinary people do when faced with power and uncertainty. I complied. The first anonymous letter was my way of resisting without exposing myself, a compromise that felt safer than confession. I told myself I wasn't responsible for what followed. But every letter reinforced the original silence, turning a single moment into a structure that supported decades of deception. The recipient knew something was wrong, but never enough to confront it directly. That ambiguity protected us both, at least on the surface. As years passed, the world moved on. New scandals replaced old ones, records disappeared, witnesses died, but that small event from the 1960s never lost its gravity. It remained the reason I wrote, the reason I hid, the reason my name stayed locked away. And the more time passed, the clearer it became that revealing the truth would no longer fix anything. It would only expose how long we had all lived inside a distorted version of reality. Have you ever realized too late that trying to control the truth can end up reshaping lives you never intended to touch? My greatest mistake was believing the letters were contained, that they existed only between me and the person who received them. I was wrong. Secrets rarely respect boundaries, especially when fear becomes a daily companion. Sometime in the early 1970s, I noticed a shift. The addresses I used began changing more frequently. Jobs were abandoned without explanation. Children were pulled from schools mid-year. Moves happened quietly, often overnight. At first I blamed coincidence. People move, lives change. But the timing was never random. Each disruption followed a letter that hinted just a little too clearly at what I knew. I wasn't threatening them, but I was reminding them that their past was not as buried as they hoped. What I failed to understand was that my words were echoing beyond the intended reader. Spouses noticed the tension. Children sensed fear they couldn't name. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Doors were locked more carefully. A household slowly reshaped itself around something invisible, something no one was allowed to explain. My letters became the silent architect of that fear, shaping decisions, relationships, and futures without ever being seen. There was one letter I regret more than the rest. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't detailed, it simply referenced a name that should have remained forgotten. After that, the family fractured. One member left and never returned. Another spent years chasing answers that would never come. Careers stalled, trust eroded, all because I believed indirect truth was safer than honesty. By then, stopping felt impossible. If I vanished, suspicion would only grow. If I confessed, destruction would be immediate. So I continued, convincing myself that consistency was kindness, that controlled fear was better than chaos. But deep down, I knew I had crossed a line. I was no longer a silent witness. I was an active force, shaping a family's destiny from the shadows. There is a moment when secrecy stops feeling powerful and starts feeling dangerous. For me, that shift came when I realized the letters were no longer just being read, they were being anticipated. In the late 1970s, patterns began to emerge. Mailboxes were checked obsessively, postmarks were tracked, the recipient started taking long, unnecessary routes home as if someone might be following them. Fear had turned into vigilance, and vigilance into paranoia. The most unsettling sign came when one of my letters was returned, unopened, with no explanation, no forwarding address, no rejection stamp. Just silence. For weeks, I panicked. Had they gone to the authorities? Had someone finally connected the fragments I had been leaking for years? I stopped writing for months, convinced that my next move could be my last as a free man. Then came the night I almost broke everything. I was older by then, slower, careless in ways I had never allowed myself to be before. I drove past their house without thinking, just to see if the lights were on. That was my mistake. A neighbor noticed. A curtain moved. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in decades. For the first time, anonymity felt thin, fragile, almost imaginary. I remember sitting in my car, heart racing, realizing how absurd it was that a lifetime of secrecy could collapse because of one impulsive decision. That night, I destroyed years of drafts, notes, and copies I had foolishly kept. Evidence burns fast, but guilt does not. I resumed writing only after I was certain the silence had not been interpreted as an admission. From then on, the letters became colder, shorter, more distant. Fear had changed both of us. They were afraid of being exposed. I was afraid of being known. And in that shared terror, an unspoken agreement formed. As long as I stayed invisible, their version of the truth could survive. And as long as they stayed silent, so could I. For most of my life, I told myself the letters were the secret, that the words, the hints, the carefully measured truths were the most dangerous part of this story. That was another lie. The real danger was always who I was, and where I stood when everything quietly went wrong. My identity was not dramatic, powerful, or famous. That is precisely why it mattered so much. I was close enough to be trusted, but insignificant enough to be overlooked. I had access without suspicion, visibility without scrutiny. In the late 1960s, when records were altered, names were adjusted and responsibility was quietly redirected, I was there, not as a mastermind, but as a necessary cog. I witnessed how a single decision could redirect blame, how an ordinary person could be placed in the path of consequences meant for someone else. And I said nothing, not because I agreed, but because silence was rewarded with safety. The person who received my letters was never the true architect of what happened. They were a convenient endpoint, someone history could live with, blaming if it ever needed a face. My letters were never meant to punish them. They were meant to remind them that I knew the truth, that the version of events they lived with was incomplete. In a strange way, the letters were my confession without consequence. I carried the guilt, but I never paid the price. What I hid for decades was this: if my name had ever been revealed, the story would have collapsed inward. Investigations would have pointed backward, not forward. Questions would have resurfaced about who altered what, who benefited, and who quietly walked away untouched. I was not protecting myself alone. I was protecting a structure built on convenience, fear, and forgotten accountability. As the years passed, I realized something even more disturbing. Time doesn't erase responsibility. It just makes it harder to assign. Every year I stayed silent. The truth became less actionable, less repairable, and more poisonous if exposed. By hiding my identity, I ensured that no one could ever fully untangle what really happened, only sense that something had been wrong all along. There comes a point in old age when the weight of silence becomes heavier than the consequences of speaking. For most of my life, revealing my identity would have ignited investigations, fractured families, and reopened wounds that were never allowed to heal. But time has thinned the branches of this story. People have died, records have vanished, and the world has forgotten the event that once threatened to unravel everything. That is precisely why I can speak now, at 88, when there is nothing left to protect except my own conscience. The truth is, I am not the villain you may imagine, but I am not innocent either. I stood too close to power, too close to decisions made behind closed doors, too close to the moment when a simple administrative correction turned into a life-altering deception. My sin was compliance, followed by silence, followed by 5 decades of anonymous reminders, sent to someone who bore the consequences I was too afraid to claim. For years, I believed knowing the truth was enough, that carrying the guilt privately was the price I paid for surviving. But guilt doesn't stay quiet. It grows roots. It shapes your habits, your fears, your routines. It whispers late at night that the person you pretended to be was never real. The letters became the only honest part of my life, even as they caused pain I never intended to inflict. Why now? Because the person who received my letters is gone. Because the family my words once terrified has scattered. Because the truth, if spoken earlier, would have destroyed people who no longer exist to confront it. And because I am running out of time. I don't fear punishment anymore. I fear being remembered incorrectly. I fear dying with the wrong story attached to my name. As I prepare to reveal who I am, I know the confession will land in a world that no longer cares about the details, but understands the weight of hidden truths. Secrets this old don't explode, they echo. And before my voice fades, I want that echo to finally carry the whole truth, not the fragments I left in envelopes for 55 years. If you reach this point, you've walked with me through decades of silence, guilt, and buried truth. People don't usually stay this long unless something in the story echoes inside them. So thank you, truly, for giving this confession the ears it never had in real life. Before you go, I want to ask for one last thing. If this story made you think about the secrets people carry or the weight of truths hidden for too many years, make sure to subscribe to the channel. These confessions only exist because there are people willing to hear them. And your subscription helps more stories, the ones no one ever dared to tell, finally come to light. If you stayed until the very end, please leave a comment saying, "I won't forget your truth." This simple line helps me know who truly listened, who truly stayed, and who understands the cost of a lifetime spent in silence. And if this final revelation moved you, don't forget to leave a like. It tells the system that these hidden stories matter, that people want more of them, and that forgotten voices deserve to be heard. When you're ready, watch the next video appearing on your screen. Another confession, another buried truth, another life you were never supposed to hear about.